So hello everyone and welcome to the 5th Freethought History Webinar. I'm Daniel James Sharp, the editor of the Freethinker. On your screen you should be able to see our website, social media links, and so on and so forth, so do check them out if you haven't already. Just so you know, this session is being recorded and it will go on YouTube and our website afterwards. So in a moment, I'm going to hand off to our guest who will speak for a little while, perhaps up to 30 minutes or however much you want, really. And then I shall open it up to the audience for comments and questions. Our guest tonight is St. Joshi, an American writer and literary critic who's written on everything from H.P. Lovecraft to American race relations, and of course, religion and atheism. He's going to talk a little bit about his new book, the second volume in his monumental history of atheism, The Downfall of God. So with that, I shall hand over to you, ST.
Good, thank you. Yes, it did amuse me to see that this title is a brief history of the downfall of God, because my book in 2 volumes is anything but brief. But even so, I somehow felt that I could have gone on even longer, but I dare say my publisher would have fainted at the prospect. Yeah, my 2 volumes cover, from prehistory up to literally last year, maybe, in about well over 1,000 pages in the 2 volumes. And perhaps it is understandable why volume 2, which covers essentially from the 17th century up to the present day, basically 4.5, not quite 4.5 centuries, is even longer than volume 1, which covered from the dawn of time up to the end of the 16th century, because the amount of material and documentary evidence on this subject in these last 4+ centuries is so immense that it took me a while to sort out what I wanted to talk about. And no doubt people will find that I omitted certain issues, certain thinkers, but there you are. I think it's important to note that what my book really is about is not simply a discussion of individual thinkers or figures who announce themselves atheists. I mean, that's interesting in itself, and the reasons why they did so is certainly of interest. There's a broader agenda, if you want to call it that, in my book, and that is the decline of religion as a factor in human life in Western civilization. And I refer not only to politics, society, religion, literature, art, music, general culture. It is almost inconceivable to people living today to have any sense of the overwhelming nature of the Christian religion in particular during especially the Middle Ages, which really from 300 AD on all the way up to basically the Renaissance and even beyond. It is impossible for us to grasp the totalizing effect of Christianity during that particular period, because we don't have any sense of it now. And the reason why we don't is because of the work of atheists and freethinkers and secularists over the last 4.5 to 5 centuries. In volume 1, I did trace the emergence of religion in general in the course of the Neolithic age, into the ancient Near East, with the religions of Judaism and Assyria and all sorts of other things, Greco-Roman religion, which is very different from the Christian religion in many ways. Then, of course, I had to discuss the emergence of Christianity in the early 1st century AD, and of course I propounded what is called the Christ myth theory, namely that the individual identified in the synoptic gospels as Jesus Christ never existed. I don't want to go into that right now because that's a whole other thing, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I've relied on the work of other biblical scholars who have embraced this theory. But anyway, I did trace necessarily the development of Christianity over the centuries and how they basically took over all aspects of culture and politics and society. And that domination finally began to crack with the Renaissance, which not only discovered a thriving civilization before Christianity, namely Greco-Roman civilization, but also in the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, effected a scientific revolution that began the process of demolishing the metaphysical tenets upon which the Christian religion was based. Now, so where do we stand in the year 1600 or 1601, which is where I start volume 2? Well, we have the emergence of certain thinkers in England and the continent, ranging from Sir Francis Bacon to Descartes, to Spinoza, to Hobbes, and any number of others. Basically, the conflict there was between the inductive method of scientific approach and the deductive method. And in my estimation, the inductive method won hands down because it was fueled by science and it allowed scientific discovery to advance, whereas the deductive method of pure rational thinking, which actually wasn't very rational in the thinking of, say, Descartes, for example, simply couldn't advance knowledge to any significant degree. What then happened is that certain thinkers, especially toward the end of the 17th century, began to wonder, how viable is the Christian religion? And the bases, the metaphysical bases on which it is supported. And that's where we find the emergence of the deist or deist school. I say deist, you say deist, maybe. The deists basically were not atheists by any stretch of the imagination. What they were was they were confronting the discontinuity between the advancing science and the tenets of Christianity, and they focused, many of them, on biblical miracles. The emergence of scientific thought had evolved to such a degree in the work of Bacon and Galileo and many others to a degree that events in the universe were considered to be the natural product of the nature of the universe. The idea of supernatural intervention had starting to become implausible. And it was particularly noted by deists and even by Christian theologians themselves that all these miracles seem to have happened at the dawn of time, but we don't have any miracles anymore. Gee, wonder why that is. So the deists tried to get around this by saying, oh, well, we don't really need these Christian miracles to believe in Christianity, because they still were Christian believers, believe it. They were not atheists by any means. But in the process of basically knocking out the supernatural underpinnings of Christianity, they essentially rendered Christianity as simply a moral system. And it then became not entirely obvious why that particular moral system should be any superior to any other moral system that could be evolved. This in part led to the French and English and German Enlightenment in the 18th century. And this is where you really have, for the first time in Western history, atheists who came out and said, yes, I am an atheist. Denis Diderot was one of the first. A great thinker who is much undervalued, Paul Thierry d'Holbach, wrote a huge book called Système de la Nature, The System of Nature, 2 volumes in 1770, still, in my estimation, the most comprehensive book advocating atheism ever written, and still of value, because it destroyed every single underpinning of the Christian religion that you could possibly think of. There's no such thing as the soul. Jesus Christ, if he even existed, was simply a human being, and so on and so forth. You don't. And what was particularly important in Dolbach and others was that one doesn't need to be a Christian or a Jew or any other religion to be a moral person, and that was hugely important. The development of secular ethics in the course of the 18th century was a vital factor in allowing people to shed Christianity, because for the longest time, from the dawn of Christianity to that era, it was believed that if you were not a Christian, you were not a good person. You could not be a moral person if you did not believe, A, in the divinity of Jesus Christ, and in particular, if you could not believe in the doctrine of future rewards and punishments in the afterlife, because basically on this thinking, they said, oh, well, you can do anything you want to, and nobody, you can kill and murder and rob people, and nothing's going to happen to you in the afterlife, so you can't possibly be a moral person. Well, that's nonsense. Because there are any number of reasons to be a moral person without belief in a future afterlife. So the 18th century was enormously important in developing a philosophical groundwork for a secular perspective. What then happened in the 19th century was that two parallel developments again did a lot to knock out the intellectual underpinnings of Christianity and other religions also. First of all was the development of biblical criticism. This was the first time, really, that biblical scholars not only examined the origins of biblical texts, the books of the Bible and so on, that had already been pioneered by Spinoza and others, but looked into how these texts came to be written. And that was enormously important, because the whole idea of treating these texts simply as literary texts or historical documents was unheard of and radical, because, of course, these texts are supposed to be inspired by God, so that was basically a way in which Christians said, oh, you can't really study these texts because they're the work of God, and so that's all there is to say. Well, that isn't all there is to say. And so people like David Friedrich Strauss, who wrote A Life of Jesus, and any number of other people said, well, there are all kinds of contradictions here in these biblical texts, and how do we account for that? And so that did a lot to undermine belief in Christianity. The final nail in the coffin, in my estimation, for Christian belief, although they didn't know it at the time, was Mr. Darwin. The scientific revolution of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries had done a lot to establish the natural order of events and the absence of a need for God to explain how the universe operated. There was one final hitch, though, and that is the great human race. Yes. It was believed that, well, okay, if animals may have come to being on their own, the universe even may have come to being on its own, but we, the great human race, well, we are such a great entity that only God could have fashioned us, and in particular, how could all the mechanisms, our eyes, our hands, and things, how could they have ever come to be without the special creation of a God? Well, Mr. Darwin said, he didn't actually say it, but the implication of the theory of evolution was, yes, even eyes and hands and other things were evolved through many millions of years to where they are today. And that destroyed forever the doctrine of the argument from design. The argument from design says, no, the hand is such a perfect mechanism that it had to have been created all at once by some God. It was implied. Well, Darwin said, No, it wasn't. And so that basically was the final nail in the coffin for religion, and that's why Richard Dawkins basically said that until when Darwin did his work, one could finally be, as he called it, an intellectually fulfilled atheist, because that was the final intellectual pillar that had to be knocked over before atheism could become truly intellectually viable. Now, of course, this didn't lead to a rash of people announcing themselves atheists. However, if you look at European culture in the 19th and into the 20th centuries, you can see a definite trend moving in that direction, where people, literary writers, scientists, philosophers, any number of them, said, I can establish a perfectly viable way of living without any religion at all. The development of a secular point of view was hugely important. In the early 20th century, what happened was that a number of important thinkers emerged to make an even more cogent intellectual case for the viability of atheism. I think chief among them has to be Bertrand Russell, who lived an incredibly long life from 1872 to 1970. I mean, here's a guy who protested World War I and also protested the Vietnam War. That's how long he lived. An incredible intellectual figure who made very, very cogent arguments in support of atheism. Sometimes he danced around whether he was really an atheist or simply an agnostic, but I think in the final analysis, I think we have to say he was an atheist. And there were many other people. What also was happening was that the Christian religion itself was starting to seem as if it was, shall we say, antiquated and backward and not even necessary anymore. A thinker named Harry Elmer Barnes in 1929 published a book called The Twilight of Christianity, still well worth reading. I mean, this guy was actually trying to defend the Christian religion, but as I say in my book, with friends like him, religion doesn't need any enemies. It is a devastating critique of the intellectual deficiencies of Christianity. And there were a number of other books along that line. And we can hardly omit discussion of the Scopes trial in 1925, where the state of Tennessee tried to banish the teaching of evolution in state schools, and this poor hapless teacher named John Thomas Scopes was made the focus of a trial in which the defense, led by the great lawyer Clarence Darrow, supported by the very dynamic and iconoclastic journalist H.L. Mencken, basically essentially put the state of Tennessee on trial for being backward and ignorant. And even though they technically lost their case, which they deliberately set out to do, they destroyed the fundamentalist movement for half a century. Unfortunately, they did not destroy it forever, and we are still stuck with fundamentalists today, but no matter. World War II had an interesting effect. It did because the battle between the Allies and Germany and Japan became a moral conflict. It was seen that it was, or at least it was held, that Germany was actually had become a pagan culture that had repudiated Christianity, and therefore its defeat by Christian allies in England and the United States and elsewhere was a victory for Christianity. What that ignored was that the Nazis actually were profoundly Christian in many of their views. There were very few atheists among the Nazis, and Hitler believed in the Christian religion and believed he was carrying out Christian doctrine, especially where it came to anti-Semitism, because the history of Christian anti-Semitism is long and unfortunate. And of course, after the war, you had the atheist communists of Russia and later China against the Christian West, and that again created this dichotomy where we felt we in the West had to defend Christianity in light of these horrible atheists. And that is where in the United States, for example, in the course of the 1950s, that's where the little motto, "In God We Trust," got stuck on all our currency and is still there in defiance of our First Amendment. Let that pass. And it's also where the silly words, "under God," got stuck into our Pledge of Allegiance, which every school child, including myself, had to utter at the beginning of every school day. I mean, I said those words without having any idea what they meant, but let it pass. But that happened in the 1950s because that was our way of fighting atheistic communism. Well, that didn't last very long because the 1960s created all kinds of cultural turmoil, and again, atheism started to flourish, and other religions and Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism came along to kind of challenge Christianity among young people. And I remember those days. I'm old enough to remember the 1960s, where the great atheist Friedrich Nietzsche enjoyed a great renaissance of interest. All sorts of people were reading Nietzsche. They were also reading his 20th rate disciple Ayn Rand, who was an atheist, but frankly somewhat a disreputable one in my estimation. But important things happened in the United States, in particular the Supreme Court case in which Madalyn Murray O'Hair, also somewhat disreputable, I'm sorry to say, because she was kind of a nut, but she did sponsor or was at the head of the Supreme Court case that banished teacher-led or school-led Christian prayer in public schools, and that was a huge step in shall we say, leveling the playing field. And you know, we've never looked back. Even this crazy conservative Supreme Court today that we have will not go back on that particular principle. Of course, the later 20th century did have a recrudescence of fundamentalist religion with the moral majority and people like that. They are still with us, but in my estimation, they are fading. The number of people who profess themselves to be evangelical or fundamentalist is about half of what it used to be in the 1970s. They may seem to be in power now, but frankly, they don't amount to much. In my estimation, what is happening now is that people may still believe that they are Christian or religious in general, and maybe they go to church 1 hour a week, but the other 167 hours a week they basically act as if there is no God. So I think what is important here is people's behavior as opposed to people's open profession or what they claim, because frankly the profession of atheism or even agnosticism is still apparently regarded as something of a somehow disreputable. It's kind of like a social faux pas, you know, as if you admit not bathing every day or something like that. But at least you're not going to get, you know, strung up by your toenails if you profess to be an atheist, as you were in prior centuries. In the civilized countries of the West, there is no more penalty for profession of disbelief in God. On that note, I cannot bypass what happened in the 19th century when in England, when the politician Charles Bradlaugh got elected as a member of Parliament, but could not be seated, or was not allowed to be seated in Parliament because he would not swear his oath of office on a Bible. And this went on for years and years and years. And he kept getting reelected in every election in the 1880s. And finally, he was allowed to sit in Parliament after all this time. And I think eventually Parliament did away with the idea of swearing an oath on the Bible. and again, that's just one step among many that I discuss in this book about how religion has basically faded from our consciousness in the course of literature and art and music and so many other things. There are lots of other details that I go into. I mean, I do talk about how English, American, and European literature evolved, into a sort of secular phenomenon. Relatively few writers in the 19th or 20th centuries really were openly religious. Many of them were openly non-religious, even though they may not have come out as atheists. Ranging from Walt Whitman to H.P. Lovecraft to so many others. What we are seeing now is perhaps a split between the intelligentsia, who is let's basically largely secular, even if not openly atheist, and a general public who may claim to believe in religion, but in my estimation, don't act in many cases as if they do. So here we are. I still believe that atheism has basically triumphed, or secularism has triumphed. There's no going back, and unless we have some sort of catastrophic collapse of civilization, which is not impossible, I think we are in a secular age and likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. So that's kind of my preliminary remarks, and we can go from there.
Yeah, well, thank you. If anyone has any questions, just wave at me physically, or by using the raise hand button, or typing in the chat box, or however else you're able to do it. But first of all, I just I want to challenge you maybe a little bit on saying there's a triumph of atheism or secularism. Maybe it's a matter of temperament, but I'm a bit more pessimistic on that score. As you say, in the US, certainly the Christian right is right, in the saddle at the moment, and certainly around the world, outside of the secular democratic Western countries. Religion is
Well,
still very powerful and dangerous.
Yeah, it is interesting that Christianity is actually spreading far more widely in, say, Africa or maybe South America, in non-Western areas, where it's either, in my estimation, stagnating or actually declining in Europe and the United States. That is an interesting phenomenon in itself, which I can't cover or didn't cover because it would have taken me too far afield. But it shows you that the promoters of Christianity feel that is where their their money is put to best use, as it were. An interesting thing in itself, but I think it shows. I mean, there were several books written over the last decade or so, basically, in which some Christian theologians basically threw in the towel, saying, the West is finished. We're done with the West. We there's no way to revive Christian belief to the degree that it was. I mean, so many of these thinkers, the Christian thinkers, look to the Middle Ages. That sort of thing will never happen again. It will never happen again unless there is a collapse of civilization. And as I say, I still believe that what people profess is not necessarily congruent with their actual behavior. I'm not saying that people behave badly. I'm not saying Christians, are hypocrites. They're, except only in the most, in the broadest sense. On our day-to-day dealings with people, I get no sense that anybody is a Christian or not a Christian. People, because our society is there's so much going on. There's so much, we're distracted by so many different things that to behave in a openly Christian manner, whatever that may be, and there's some debate as to what is it, how do you lead a Christian life, is itself a matter of debate. simply doesn't come up. And as I say, maybe I live in a sheltered life. I don't know. I live in a part of the United States that is, shall we say, famously secular. My state of Washington, I live in Seattle, Washington, has probably the lowest level of church attendance of any state in the United States. So maybe I'm you know, I don't get a full range. I mean, I don't live in Arkansas. I don't live in Tennessee. I don't live in Mississippi, where Christianity still is very dominant. So I understand that. That's why I say there may be a sort of split between the intelligentsia and the general populace, both here and in England and Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I could talk about this forever, because it's one of my little obsessions at the moment, is this. I do think there is a certain, at least in a political sense, a revival of Christianity, but on the whole, religion is still in decline. I think that's pretty undeniable.
It is interesting that even, if I am correct about our secular age, it is interesting how few politicians are still courageous enough to come out as atheists, or even as agnostics or secularists. For example, I have very little doubt that the great Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont, is an atheist. He's in a long line of Jewish atheists going way back. But he hasn't come out and said so, and he won't. And because it's still considered a political liability, and that is unfortunate, because it forces these politicians to be basically hypocrites. They're already hypocrites in many other ways, and this is just one more way in which they are forced to be hypocrites, and it's too bad.
All right,
but
I
we have
see
some other
hands
questions
up.
here.
So yep, I shall call upon Bob Forder. You'll have to.
Your mic is not on, or your audio is not on.
Here we go. Right.
There we go.
Right. Thanks very much. First of all, I thought that was interesting and punchy presentation. How's that? And on one level, very persuasive. And I feel a bit schizophrenic about this, actually, because there's one side of me that half believes me, wants to believe you, and another side that's more concerned. Here in the UK, it is generally taken that our society is fairly secular, yet we have religious representation in one of our Houses of Parliament. We have church schools, and the number of them is increasing. We have fewer and fewer politicians who are willing to associate themselves with non-belief and with the sort of iconic freethought heroes of this country. The BBC is permeated by religion. And we have the rise of fairly, fundamentalist Islam in this country as well. So that side of me is more skeptical. I'd be interested what you have to say to that. I do want to interject one other point, if you don't mind, because it is frequently said, but incorrect. Bradlaugh, who perhaps is, in my mind anyway, an iconic figure in the freethought atheist movement in this country. Bradlaugh, although he asked, when first elected as a member for Northampton in 1881, though he asked if he could affirm, because you could affirm in the courts of law, when he was told by the Speaker that he could not, he did in fact attempt on a number of occasions to take the oath on the Bible. But he wasn't allowed to. That was the point.
The whole Bradlaugh case is extremely complicated, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But I read there's a very, very good book on the subject. I cite it in my bibliography, and basically use it. I mean, this guy did everything possible, even at if you want to call it compromising his principles, to get into Parliament. but the opposition against him was so ferocious, and the things that were said against him were like, I mean, this guy was called, the devil incarnate. No, I couldn't believe that in the later 19th century, people could say things like this that sound so medieval. Yes, it's a very complicated situation. But the fact is that eventually the opposition basically collapsed, and I think they just sort of gave up and said, "All right, go ahead, fine."
Yes.
But it's a very interesting case, and his writings are very interesting. I reprinted one of his essays called "Humanity's Gain from Unbelief." It's a brilliant essay, oddly enough, published in an American magazine, the North American Review. One of the best pieces on this specific subject that I've ever read. But in terms of, since I don't live in the UK, I can only gauge by what is going on. I mean, yes, you still have an established church, and I don't suppose there's any movement particularly to disestablish the Anglican Church. But the thing is, the Anglican Church is a shadow of its former self, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, sure, there's now an Archbishop of Canterbury who's a woman, isn't it? That's kind of interesting, but not that anybody cares. But well, maybe some people care. But I believe that the number of people professing themselves Anglicans in the UK is very, very low, isn't it?
Yep.
It's incredibly low. I mean, there are far more professing Catholics than Anglicans, which would have been, absolutely unheard of since there was basically political and other disabilities against Catholics all the way up to 1829. Only then did some of the disabilities get removed by an act of Parliament. Yeah, and the thing is, in the United States, I think it cannot be overstressed that the United States really was one of the first major nations founded without an established church. That was huge in my estimation, because actually it's funny. Some of the politicians and thinkers at that time said, "Well, if religion, if we allow all these religions in, kind of as a free for all, then they all end up, counteracting each other, or it's like whatever. It's just a religious free for all." And I love what many people in this country who are religiously based do not want to admit that many of the important founders like Jefferson and Madison and even Ben Franklin and a number of others were not devout Christians. They were not. I love Thomas Jefferson's comment when he said something like, "It does me no harm if a man professes in one God, 20 gods, or no gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my bones." That's a brilliant comment. It just shows you that the tendency of his thinking. And Jefferson and Madison were critical in establishing our First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of religion and also guarantees freedom from religion, although many Christian thinkers do not think that, but that is the implicit guarantee there also. So yeah, and in the United States, our Christian fundamentalists are really a bunch of crazy people, and they seem to be dominant now. But frankly, as I say, I've lived through the fundamentalist movement from the 1970s on to today, and they really are don't amount to as much as people think they do. And you have to kind of get a long view of things. Don't get obsessed with what happened on a day-to-day basis. I think that's not the right way to look at things. Bill Cook, I think, has something.
Yeah, I've got your name noted down, Bill. I'll just go through some of the others first. I'll just do it in order
Okay.
of people. So Claire Welsh, I think, was next.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. That was really, really interesting. So I think you noted possibly the sort of collective, slightly sharp intake of breath when your comments were about how it's declining. You're quite positive around that religion's hold on society is declining. I see two major issues in the path, and I just wanted to get your comments on those. In the States, so I'm from the States as well. I was born in Alabama, so I've still got lots of friends in those kind of hotspot areas. Yes, that face is what everybody's going to mention Alabama in this respect. So the polarity of US politics is obviously very extreme, has been for a long time. It's always been a two-party system. It's getting even more and more extreme. And obviously Christian fundamentalism, but generally speaking, religion has hitched its wagon very, very strongly to the Republican side of that polarized element there. So it's seen as a fundamental component of being Republican, it seems to be, from my perspective, as being somebody, a Scottish person but living in England with American family. That polarization feels to me like it's growing across the West. It's becoming more entrenched, it's becoming more extreme. And we're seeing it much more here in the UK as well. And we're seeing the kind of fundamentalist element come in. Now, the religious element of the right wing is not as pronounced here necessarily yet as it is in the States, but I feel like it's coming. We've got a lot more Christianity being pushed quite fundamentally here as well that's happening. So my worry is that Christianity itself, if it were not for this badging as one side of this polarized divide, would potentially be, stepping back quite quickly. However, because it's having this association with right-wing politics, and that polarization is continuing and becoming more extreme, then that's a problem, because that feels like that's going to bake into the future quite significantly. So that's one thing that I worry about. The other thing is also around the Anglican Church that you mentioned. So the way that it seems like Christianity is handling itself in England these days is that it's trying to portray, and it has done for a very long time, a really soft, gentle, kind, all-inclusive, lovely, unthreatening face to the world, right? And I see this with my kids who are in school and all these other kind of scenarios as well, that they don't engage in difficult topics. They're trying to present some different face to the world that is a much less intense one and not fundamentalist by definition, but is also something that the average person on the street would feel like if they moved away from that, they were moving away from a cozy environment, and one that's already baked into their society. So why would people do that? It takes a strong person to look at that from a free thinker's perspective and say, hang on a minute, you're saying this is all nice and accepting, and you are nice and accepting of me because I happen to be white and middle class. You're not nice and accepting of a bunch of other people I know. There's not many people that will choose to make that distinction. So the fact that the Anglican Church and generally Christianity in this country is moving that way, and we've got the polarized nature of politics hitching its wagon, the right wing at least, to the religious element, feels like two things to me that are a worry for. I want to believe you. I want to believe that it's going away. It's starting out.
Well, okay. Again, the association of Christian people, or especially fundamentalists, with right-wing politics is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because if and when, and it happens often, the right wing gets out of power, then those fundamentalists are out of power too. I think it's a bad idea to associate yourself with a single political party. And again, you take the long view. Back in the 1950s, here, all the politicians were Christian. Believe me, a certain number of Jews were allowed to be. Okay, you're a Jew, that's fine. I mean, those measures that I mentioned, the putting of "in God we trust" on our currency, and the sticking of the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, were supported by huge majorities, Democrats and Republicans alike. That would not happen today. Yeah, I mean, there's a particularly aggressive movement of Christian nationalism going on right now. I obviously see it here, but again, all I can say is maybe I lead a sheltered life, and I don't perceive it, or it doesn't affect me any. I mean, and I have trouble seeing how it really affects others, except in places like the South, or the Plains states of places like Kansas and other places like that, where Christianity appears to be dominant. But even there, even in those places, the big cities like Atlanta or St. Louis are quite liberal, and they regularly send Democrats to Congress. So it's hard for me to estimate the effect of these movements. I still believe that Christian fundamentalism, which emerged in the 1970s as a reaction basically to 1960s, sexual freedom and things like that. They were not specifically concerned with the rise of atheism because not a whole lot of people in the 60s professed to be atheists. What they did profess to be was to scorn the whole notion of religion ruling their sexual lives, including abortion, of course. Um, uh, that movement was actually much scarier back in the 1970s than it is now. It could be said that this particularly aggressive form of Christian nationalism that is happening now is kind of a last flailing, movement of something that is dying. I don't know. It's very hard to say. Obviously, we have to be vigilant, and we can't allow these sorts of things just to roll us over. And there are plenty of organizations here. There's a Freedom from Religion Foundation here, and any number of other places that the American Civil Liberties Union that do a lot to counteract this kind of stuff, especially if it tries to force religion down people's throats. The difference is, of course, that the United States has a First Amendment, England does not. So that does seem to be an issue. No matter how the Supreme Court chips away at the First Amendment, it is simply too strong to be overwhelmed. So whatever. I still don't know how these movements really affect people's day-to-day lives. That's what I'm trying to get at. I frankly do not see most professing Christians behaving in an explicitly Christian manner. And again, I'm not saying they behave badly. They simply behave as any other people behave, as secularists behave. Okay, so they go to church 1 hour a week, then 167 hours a week they behave like everybody else. So it's very hard for me to say. And where this is going to go, who knows? But there we are.
All right, Nathan Alexander. If you can, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be pretty quick. Just a comment first that I first came across your work actually during my PhD a while ago. It was actually a book you had co-edited about letters from H.P. Lovecraft to James F. Morton.
Yes.
I was writing a section in my PhD about Morton at the time, and so that book was actually super helpful for me. So thanks for that. My question is kind of about, well, this kind of paradox where it seems like Christians actually, or deists even, are kind of paradoxically the ones who kind of supply a lot of these arguments for atheism in a way that they've kind of sowed the seeds of their own kind of downfall in a way. For example, in the 19th century, like biblical criticism, most of these people are Christians. So maybe I don't know if you just want to say more about that. Do you think that's the case that maybe even that you could say that Christians themselves are perhaps more responsible than atheists or free thinkers, for kind of we'll say the decline of Christian arguments, we'll say.
I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's a very complex issue. Mr. Isaac Asimov, I remember, who was an atheist, great science fiction writer, and great commentator in general, basically said that the Bible has made more atheists than any other phenomenon there's some truth to that, to be sure. If you actually read the Bible carefully, you would come upon all kinds of things that nobody can possibly believe in. I mean, do we really want to execute witches? Do we really want to kill off all gays? Do we really want to execute people who violate the Sabbath? Which in the United States, by the way, would mean that every single professional football player would have to be executed. Don't think we want to go there. But of course, and I love examining the Ten Commandments. Oh man, do we really want to believe that a wife is the property of her husband? among other things like slaves. There is not one single passage in the Bible that condemns slavery as an institution, and many passages that support it, and so on. But of course, you'll never hear that from Christians, especially from Christian theologians who want to brush that under the rug. But in my more cynical moments, I actually want to have people teach the Bible in schools, but of course they'd never teach these parts. Let me teach those parts. I'll be happy to do so. So I don't know what to say. I address in my book a number of the arguments that theologians have made over the centuries in support of Christianity, and I do try to dynamite them, ranging from the great William Paley, who wrote about he was the last gasp of the whole doctrine of the argument from design, and Joseph Butler, and all the way up to the present day with people like Richard Swinburne, and is still around apparently. He's a very old man now, but and I kind of kick him in the butt. It's actually, in my estimation, very easy to refute these Christian theologians. But they're still at it, and I don't know what else there's to say. But yeah, but the thing is, what they are trying to defend is a very weak version of Christianity, as opposed to what it was again in the Middle Ages or even into the Renaissance. So we're in a very different period from that era.
Robert Stovald.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I think that even if we agree that religion's on the decline, you couldn't really say that reason is on the ascendancy, could you?
By no means.
Look at the during the COVID pandemic, drink bleach. You've got some ridiculous thing, and the pushback against global warming, any number of scientific ideas that people are turning away from, in part because of religion. But I also feel it's connected also to what you were saying about Christianity being more sort of diffuse and less definite about what it believes, and try to be nice soft environment. A problem atheists have now, it seems to me, is that fewer people know what we're fighting against. They sort of, well, why don't you just let Christians be? And a lot of Christians are sort of fairly harmless on a day-to-day basis, but you still want to point out the flaws in their books, and so I think almost the fact that Christianity is less well known now is really a bit of a problem for atheists. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's something to be said for that. I think what atheists and secularists generally should be doing more of, and the so-called new atheists didn't do that quite enough. I've heard, of course, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and a few others, is to establish what a secular way of life or a secular morality actually is and would entail. I think that's an important thing to do. I mean, the arguments against the metaphysical arguments against Christianity to me are quite obvious. I don't even know that many Christians even believe in those arguments or believe in the metaphysical foundations of Christianity. They just say they're Christians because they were brought up to be Christians. And it's, that's all they know. We have to come up with an alternate kind of perspective as to what living a life as not as necessarily an atheist or as a secularist actually means. And I think there's more work to be done in that regard.
Oh, sorry. Bill Cook.
I've got a question on a slightly different perspective. I'm worried about the way your book's going to be received, given that you're supporting the mythical Jesus thesis. This worries me in terms of the academic credibility of your book. You've put in all this fantastic work for 2 volumes of a history of atheism, which is so important and so needed. But I remember the review of the first volume in Free Inquiry by
Wait, the
I
editor,
can't remember his name,
Lindsay,
the editor of Free Inquiry
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
who commented on that
Mhm.
correctly, I think. Is it not going down a rabbit hole that doesn't have academic support outside of a relatively few people in the United States, not in the academy, and that there's no record within academic literature supporting the myth theory whatever, that it's worryingly going to discredit your book and humanist scholarship in a broader capacity?
Oh, I don't know about that. That's just one chapter of like 20 pages out of a book of more than 1,000 pages. But I understand why people might fixate on that. What I say, I think I said this in another podcast. When I think there's a Wikipedia entry on the Christ myth theory, and it quotes some theologian saying, "Well, you could no theological seminary will ever hire a person who embraces the Christ myth theory." Well, yes, I dare say, no college will ever hire a football coach who believes that football is harmful to your health and should be banned. They're basically covering their asses. But to my mind, the evidence, let's just say, even people who do not embrace the theory, and I quote them in my book, basically have concluded that it is impossible to know what Jesus Christ, assuming he existed, actually believed, because
that's a
synoptic,
different point.
Yeah, that but it's a related point, because if you do not know what this person, assuming he existed, believed, you cannot base your religion upon it. Surely, people say, "Oh, Christianity is the religion of love and kindness and tolerance." Well, it isn't. There are many other passages put in the mouth of Jesus that say something very different, and the history of Christianity is very different from that. I like to think, especially in volume 2, that I cover a lot of different bases that people will have very a hard time coming to the conclusion that I'm a crank. So whatever, we'll just go from there. That's the best I can do.
Just on that point, actually, just very briefly, as it happens, earlier today I was interviewing a guy called Gavin Evans, writer, journalist, lecturer, who's written a book called Bible Stories, which goes into the religious texts and how they were collated over the centuries, etc., etc. He has a chapter on the Christ myth debate, which is very interesting and I think very even-handed. So I'll just leave that there as a recommendation for everyone out there. But time for just one more, I think. Akash Srinivas.
Hi guys, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, first of all, I just had one thing to say in defense of Mr. Joshi, that Christ myth theory, I think there is actually a qualified Bible scholar called Richard Carrier in America, and he's written a series of books on this subject, and he's apparently done a very good job of showing the lack of evidence that Jesus existed, and the main preeminent Bible scholars like Bart Ehrman, for example, have not really done a real proper serious review of his book, and they basically fail to answer his argument. So I think we could actually win this argument, and it wouldn't be too difficult, I think. But that's just a side point. But my question for Mr. Joshi was, how much does he credit anarchist and communist movements in their influence of spreading atheism? Because it's sometimes forgotten, in my opinion. But for example, anarchist philosophers like Mikhail Bakunin or Emma Goldman wrote on this subject. I don't know. Yeah, Joseph Proudhon, the anarchist philosopher, might have been an atheist or not, but I'm pretty sure Mikhail Bakunin was. He wrote a treatise in 1882, God in the States, and I wanted to understand how much you credit their influence.
Yeah, no, I do discuss that to some degree in my book. Yeah, the French socialists of the 19th century and the Russian figures late 19th and the 20th century. They wrote some very interesting material. I just don't know the extent to which it was broadly influential. But of course, especially with people like Emma Goldman and Bakunin, it became very easy to pass them off or dispense with them as cranks and radicals and things like that. That's always the rhetorical means by which people dismiss views of that sort. But I think it had an influence, to be sure. I think more of an influence was the emergence of what I called secular societies, especially in the UK. There was a lot of them coming up. Bradlaugh certainly was a part of one of those major movements, and there were other figures, G.W. Foote and a number of them. Because I've witnessed this personally. Atheists and freethinkers and secularists don't actually join together because we're too independent. We actually think for ourselves, and it in some ways that's a handicap because it doesn't allow us to show our numbers and to be a force in society and politics. And that's unfortunate. It's the famous, it's the herding cats syndrome. It's very, very difficult to do. I myself am not a joiner. I don't like to be a part of a movement. I am myself. Maybe that's a certain arrogance in that. But I have never been a member of any of these organizations. Maybe I should have, but I haven't. But yeah, I think those kinds of movements and thinkers did play a role. I think overwhelmingly, though, the advance of science and how science filtered into the consciousness, and of course, arguments based on science probably had a more significant effect than these political writers.
Well, I think that's just about us, really. So thank you very much again, ST, for joining us, for talking to us. I'll just put up a little screen again, just to encourage everyone to check out these links and perhaps even to donate to us if they can. We are an independent magazine and we have historic funds and we rely on the generosity of readers to keep going. So we've got to get that in. Do also check out ST's website. I think is it stjoshi.org?
That's right.
And you can get his book there, I'm sure. So thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate it coming along.
Good talking to everybody.